What if I told you the greatest financial threat to humanity isn't a future crisis, but the system we're already living in? Every nation on Earth is drowning in numbers too large to comprehend. The United States sits on $38 trillion of obligations, Japan on $9 trillion, and humanity as a whole is weighed down by $315 trillion, 3 times the size of the global economy. And yet, here's the part that should make your stomach drop. If every government, every bank, every corporation, every household is in debt, then who exactly is the world borrowing from? Follow the thread far enough. Trace every IOU back to its source. And the picture turns unsettling. The borrower and the lender start looking dangerously alike, until you realize the world doesn't owe money to someone else. It owes money to itself. That circular loop, this global Ouroboros of credit, didn't appear by accident. It was built deliberately, methodically, across 3 centuries. And the engineers were 4 men whose decisions, agreements, and legislation verified in public record still pulse through the bloodstream of modern finance. Their design governs every budget showdown, every bailout, every recession, every headline done warning you about unsustainable debt, because the truth isn't that the system is broken. The truth is that it's working exactly as intended, and once you see how this trap was constructed, there's no going back. Before the late 1600s, sovereign borrowing worked like a seasonal ritual. A king needed money. He approached a circle of merchants or nobles, took the funds, and eventually paid them back with interest. If repayment never came, the fallout was contained. A default bruised a monarch's reputation. Lenders took their losses, and the financial slate reset itself. Debts evaporated like storms that broke over an empire and then drifted away. But in 1694, that cycle snapped. England was bleeding money in its war with France. The treasury was empty. Tax revenue wasn't enough, and traditional lenders refused another round of risk after earlier defaults. Into that desperation stepped William Paterson, a Scottish merchant with a history of failed schemes but a talent for imagining structures no one else dared to propose. He approached King William III with an idea that didn't just solve a short-term crisis, it rewired how nations would finance themselves for the next 3 centuries. Paterson offered a loan of £1.2 million, an enormous sum for its time. The catch or the genius was that the principal would never be repaid. England would owe the interest forever, an 8% annual stream guaranteed by Parliament's taxing power. In exchange, Paterson proposed creating a new institution to oversee this arrangement, the Bank of England. If the king agreed, the merchants would hand over their gold, the bank would lend it to the government would pay interest indefinitely, and those interest payments would flow back to the lenders in a clean, predictable stream. The debt wouldn't end. It would be designed not to end. And Parliament approved it. Overnight, debt transformed from a temporary burden into a permanent fixture. Even more revolutionary, the bank was allowed to issue notes backed by the government's IOU, turning sovereign debt into currency itself. The more the government borrowed, the more money could be created. A new kind of weather system had formed, one where loans no longer cleared the sky but hung over society like a manufactured climate. Governments could now live inside this storm indefinitely, feeding it with taxes while financiers harvested interest year after year. England's war with France had pushed the kingdom to the brink. The treasury was empty, tax revenue already committed, and merchants who once financed the crown now refused after earlier defaults. Into that dead end stepped William Paterson with a proposal that felt like controlled sorcery: raise £1.2 million, pay 8% interest, and never repay the principal. Debt would no longer clear, it would live forever. To manage the new arrangement, he proposed the Bank of England, where merchants would deposit gold and the government would borrow it, with Parliament's taxing power as the guarantee. When Parliament approved the plan in 1694, England didn't just fund a war, it created the first permanent national debt, a structure that allowed borrowing to continue indefinitely as long as taxes kept the interest alive. Across Europe, governments borrowed too, but their systems remained scattered and improvised. That changed in the early 1800s when Nathan Rothschild built a 5-city financial network capable of moving money faster than any government messenger. Instead of lending directly, he bought bonds at a discount and resold them, turning sovereign IOUs into globally tradable assets. A British bond might pass from London to Frankfurt to Paris in days. Suddenly, one nation's default threatened investors across the continent. And in 1815, When Rothschild learned of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo before anyone in London, he briefly sold British bonds to trigger panic, then bought vast quantities at collapsed prices. When the victory became public, he made a fortune and demonstrated that controlling information meant controlling sovereign finance. By the early 1900s, the United States was growing rapidly but still operated on a fragile, gold-bound banking system. When the 1907 panic hit, it was J.P. Morgan who locked bankers in his library and forced them to save failing institutions with their own money. The rescue worked but revealed a national vulnerability America relied on one man to prevent collapse. So, in 1910, Morgan's associates met secretly on Jekyll Island to design a new system, one that appeared public and decentralized, but ensured private banks significant influence over money creation. When Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, the Juarez gained a central bank able to create money by buying government bonds, guaranteeing an endless buyer for federal debt. Borrowing no longer depended on existing funds. The Fed could manufacture demand on command. By the late 1970s, this global structure faced a new threat: runaway inflation eroding confidence in the dollar. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker made a harsh choice. From 1979 to 1982, he raised interest rates from 11% to 20%, the highest in Uruguay's history. Inflation collapsed, but so did the finances of developing nations whose dollar-denominated loans suddenly tripled. Mexico owed $80 billion, Brazil $60 billion, Argentina $40 billion, and none could pay. A wave of defaults threatened major American banks. Volcker could have allowed the system to reset. Instead, he used the IMF to refinance the debts, not to reduce them, but to keep interest payments flowing. In exchange, countries accepted austerity, privatization, and devaluation, surrendering economic autonomy to stay inside the system. Across 1694, 1815, 1913, and 1982, each crisis didn't break the structure, it strengthened it. Permanent debt became global debt became infinitely expandable debt became inescapable. What began as a financial workaround evolved into a climate of permanent, engineered atmosphere that every nation on Earth now breathes. What these four men built wasn't a string of clever innovations, it was the slow construction of a machine. Patterson set the first gear in 1694 by breaking the ancient rule that debt must end. Once Parliament approved a loan, England would never repay. The Crown locked itself into paying interest forever. A stream secured by taxation. In one stroke, debt stopped behaving like a burden and started acting like a permanent river feeding those who held the government's notes. Rothschild, in the early 1800s, widened that river into a global delta by buying bonds at a discount, reselling them, and circulating sovereign IOUs across London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. He created a web so interconnected that a single missed payment could shake the entire continent. After his early knowledge of Waterloo in 1815 let him scoop up British bonds at their lowest point. Governments understood the new reality once debt becomes international. Default is no longer a financial option, it's a systemic detonation. Morgan's era added the mechanism that made the system self-feeding. His circle's secret meeting on Jekyll Island in 1910, followed by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, gave the U a central bank able to create money by purchasing government bonds. That meant there would always be a buyer, an institution capable of manufacturing the very dollars it used to fund federal borrowing. Demand for sovereign debt became infinite. Limits evaporated. Volcker's actions in the early 1980s sealed the structure. When he raised interest rates from 11% to 20%, countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina were pushed into mathematical impossibility. Under the old model, they would have defaulted and cleared the slate. But American banks were too exposed. Instead, the IMF refinanced the debts not to resolve them, but to keep interest flowing. The loans stayed alive, the payments continued, and debtor nations surrendered economic autonomy as the price of staying plugged into the system. Taken together, the pattern sharpened into something almost architectural. Permanent debt became global debt became infinitely expandable debt, and infinitely expandable debt became inescapable debt. Four locks installed over centuries on the same vault door. Whenever the structure is threatened, it repairs itself if borrowers falter. The IMF refinances if markets hesitate. Central banks create money. If budgets crumble, taxes rise. The debt can't be paid off because the money supply depends on it. Default can be allowed because the network is too interconnected. Borrowing can't stop because the currency itself is tied to the debt, and interest must flow forever because that is the quiet heartbeat of the machine. Once you see how the machine was built, the next truths land harder because they reveal the parts hiding in plain sight. The components so normalized, they become invisible. The first realization is that US dollars don't simply roll off a printing press, they come into existence the moment the government borrows. Treasury issues a bond. The Federal Reserve or private institutions buy it, and that purchase injects new money into the economy, which leads to the unsettling consequence if the U.S. somehow wiped its $38 trillion clean. The dollars tied to those bonds would vanish too. A massive share of the money supply would implode, triggering a deflationary collapse. What appears to be a liability is, in reality, the scaffolding holding the entire system upright. The next twist is even stranger. Around $18 trillion of U.S. debt isn't owed abroad, it's owed to Social Security, Medicare, and other trust funds. These programs lend their excess revenue to the government and receive treasury bonds in return. But when retirees need benefits or Medicare needs funding, those bonds must be redeemed, forcing the government to tax more or borrow again. It's a closed loop. The government owes itself, but itself is ultimately taxpayers who must provide the cash. The circle turns, but the interest never disappears. Then, there's the silent burden almost no one sees. Roughly $1 trillion a year in interest gets paid out. Not as a dramatic budget line, but through normal tax revenues distributed to the institutions holding government bonds, pension funds, mutual funds, insurers, giant asset managers. For ordinary workers, it operates like a hidden tax. Money flows in from the public and flows up toward those institutions, year after year, without debate or resistance. And the final twist, debt isn't just an obligation. It's the foundation of the entire financial ecosystem. Every treasury bond becomes collateral and anchor for portfolios, a safety core for banks, a tool for central banks to manage policy. The more debt exists, the more collateral exists, the more collateral exists, the more debt the system can sustain. It's a self-amplifying loop, a structure that grows stronger the larger it becomes. Follow every thread and the design becomes unmistakable. Patterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it limitless. Volcker made it inescapable. Their combined legacy is a world where paying down debt is dangerous, default is catastrophic, borrowing is mandatory, and interest must flow forever. The trap doesn't malfunction as the numbers rise, it stabilizes, it hardens. It becomes the very mechanism through which money itself is created. This isn't a system collapsing, it's one finally revealing what it was always meant to be. Look at the world today and you can see the long shadow of those four architects stretching across every major economy. Japan carries roughly $9 trillion in government debt, most of it held by domestic institutions and the Bank of Japan itself. Europe sits on about $14 trillion, woven through the balance sheets of regional banks and the European Central Bank. China runs its own vast stack of obligations, much of it absorbed by state-owned banks, and at the center of global finance. The United States maintained its $38 trillion burden, split between public institutions, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and the government's own trust funds like Social Security and Medicare. None of these numbers stand alone. They're part of an elaborate circuit. Each nation holds slices of everyone else's debt. Japan parks its savings in U.S. Treasuries. Europe channels capital into developing nations through institutions like the World Bank. The United States, through the IMF, stabilizes European economies when crises threaten to spill over. The global system looks less like a series of separate balance sheets and more like a spiderweb where each strand depends on the tension of all the others. Pull one thread too hard and something snaps somewhere else. No country can afford to let another fall, not because of charity, but because the collapse would ricochet across portfolios, banks, and central institutions that all rely on the same network of IOUs. And in the middle of this web, cite the institutions that manage the world's savings. BlackRock Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity. They hold the bonds that governments rely on and collect the interest funded by taxpayers across continents. Money flows from American workers, European households, Japanese citizens, and developing nations navigating IMF-imposed austerity all upward, into the balance sheets of asset managers that act as the modern custodians of the debt machine. They don't need to orchestrate anything. The system channels the payments to them automatically, like a massive circulatory loop pumping wealth from the base of society toward the institutions perched at the top. When you zoom out, the pattern reads like an echo of the original blueprint drawn centuries ago. Nations borrow. Other nations buy their bonds. Those bonds become collateral for more borrowing. Every link strengthens another. The world's debt is no longer a collection of isolated obligations. It's an interconnected lattice built over 300 years. A structure that ensures that if anyone stops paying, everyone gets hurt. The logic that began with Patterson, expanded under Rothschild, institutionalized by Morgan, and enforced through Volcker, now defined the financial architecture of the entire planet. Everyone owes everyone. And in the cascading layers of that structure, interest rises like steam from a vast engine, always upward, always toward the same destinations. If you line up the last 3 centuries like a sequence of falling dominoes, the stage we're in now feels less like a moment in time and more like the logical conclusion of everything that came before it. The first domino fell in 1694 when permanent government debt was born. Another dropped in 1815 when that debt became global and deeply entangled. The next fell in 1913 when central banks led by the Federal Reserve were given the ability to create money by purchasing government bonds, removing any real limit on how much nations could borrow. And another slammed down in 1982 when Paul Volcker's rate shock proved that even when countries can't pay, default isn't an option. They will be refinanced, restructured, nudged back into making interest payments no matter the cost. Add these pieces together and you arrive at where we stand today, a world carrying $315 trillion in debt. A number so vast it feels less like accounting and more like geology. In many nations, annual interest payments now overshadow entire GDPs. Governments aren't paying debts down, they're rolling them forward, renewing them, stacking new obligations on old ones because the system demands continuity, not closure. And because so much of this debt is cross-held, Japan owning yukiani bonds, Europe holding developing world obligations. Global banks and institutions woven through every layer, a default in one region threatens the stability of all the others. No country is an island anymore. Every balance sheet is tied to the next. Money itself has fused with sovereign debt. Remove the debt and the money supply collapses. Expand the debt and the machine generates fresh currency to keep everything moving. It's as if the financial world has entered a late evolutionary stage, one where the system has settled into its mature form. What looks like a crisis isn't a malfunction, it's a steady state environment built around ever-growing obligations. The structure doesn't aspire to solve debt, it depends on debt the way a living organism depends on oxygen. We aren't witnessing a breakdown. We're inside the endgame of a design that has finally completed its arc, a machine optimized not to resolve but to endure, feeding on the very cycles it creates. When you trace the arc from 1694 to 1982, the pattern becomes almost disturbingly clean, as if 4 different men, separated by oceans and centuries, were unknowingly assembling the same machine one gear at a time. Patterson anchored the first piece by making national debt permanent. Rothschild expanded it into a cross-border network so vast that default would shake entire continents. Morgan embedded the mechanism inside the state by giving central banks the power to create money through government bonds. And Volcker locked the doors by proving that even when nations can't pay, when Mexico's $80 billion, Brazil's $60 billion, or Argentina's $40 billion became unmanageable, the system will not allow them to walk away. Their debt will be refinanced, extended, and kept alive so interest continues to flow. None of these men collaborated, yet each solution reinforced the one before it, like 4 craftsmen unknowingly contributing to the same cathedral. And that cathedral is the structure we live in now, a global architecture where debt isn't treated as a glitch or an emergency, but as the backbone of modern economies. Interest isn't a problem to be solved, it's the rent governments pay for the privilege of existing inside the financial world those architects helped shape. Power doesn't sit with presidents or parliaments, it sits wherever the bonds are held, in institutions and funds that rely on a never-ending stream of payments from taxpayers who may never fully grasp the machinery built above their heads. The $38 trillion owed by the United States isn't a countdown to catastrophe. It's the engine's fuel, a constant flow upward to pension funds, banks, asset managers, and entities that depend on those interest payments the way a turbine depends on heat. When you step back, the design reveals itself. Debt that never ends, interest that never stops. Governments that can never escape because the money they use is born from the very borrowing they're trying to outrun. It isn't a trap born of malice, it's a structure born of necessity, a system so deeply woven into the global economy that shutting it off would collapse the very thing it keeps alive. What began as a wartime workaround in 1694 has become the operating system of the modern world. And once you see that the machine is doing exactly what it was built to do, the illusion of chaos dissolves. You start to understand that this isn't disorder, it's design. If all of this has shifted the way you see government debt, if those massive figures no longer feel like random warnings, but like the steady grinding of a machine built long before you were born, then you're starting to see past the surface. The illusion fades once you recognize the pattern. A world running on obligations that never end, interest that never sleeps, and structures set in motion centuries ago by people who never knew each other but shaped your reality all the same. And that recognition isn't meant to frighten you, it's meant to wake you. Because there are more layers to this design, more hands that shape it, more mechanisms quietly steering the world you move through every day. So stay curious, stay alert. The machine behind the curtain is vast, and what you've seen here is only the first outline of how it works and who it serves.